Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 9 audio lecture for English 1010. Today, I want to just offer a couple of reminders about Essay 4, and I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the reading that I asked you to do for this week, primarily the Dana Stevens essay regarding flip-flops or about flip-flops. And I'll start with actually the announcements. So double check the due date for Essay 4 because the pacing for this assignment, I've frankly given you, I believe, an additional week. So that means you have additional time to submit a rough draft, to think about possible ideas, brainstorm, etc. But just know when everything is due and plan accordingly. And also know if I haven't released it yet, I'll double check. I intend to release the student analysis video for Essay 4 at some point this week. And again, if I have already done it and simply forgot, it's there, it's in Yuja. I would encourage you to watch it because I think those videos are always helpful and effective, and many of them are quite short, 10, maybe 15 minutes at the most. And of course, if you have not read the assignment prompt, please do so. Okay, let's transition and talk a bit about Dana Stevens and how much she seems to dislike flip-flops. So the first thing I'll say just at large, and you may have detected this from the introduction, Dana Stevens, specifically for this website, Slate, at least as I am recording this, she is the website's film critic at large, which means she's not someone who spends her days and weeks writing about footwear and footwear sensibilities. She primarily writes about film. And so one of the things that I wanted to emphasize is how just because something may not fall under, let us say, your area of expertise, whatever those are, that doesn't mean you cannot write about it. In fact, what I really like about this essay is how Stevens identifies, and she's encouraged by her editor, but Stevens identifies something that really bothers her, a particular problem that she wants to think through and explore. And I think those are the kinds of topics, those topics where it's just something that seems to reside, as we say, rent-free in your head, and you just need an opportunity to exercise those thoughts. You need an opportunity to exercise those thoughts and feelings. I think those sorts of topics are always the best ones and always the most interesting, because you as the writer are almost automatically engaged, you're interested, there's a degree of enthusiasm, and that's something that is possible to manufacture, but it's really hard to generate or create this sensation that you are genuinely enthusiastic about something when you are not. So the point is, definitely search for those topics that you are enthusiastic about, that you are interested in, and this is something I have said consistently throughout this semester. And I wanted to start actually there with the opening paragraph because, again, I think this is an excellent example of how even in an essay where Stevens, she conducts interviews, she's incorporating a lot of different information, that does not mean she cannot and does not use narrative as a pattern, because that is very much how Stevens leads her reader into this essay. That is very much how she introduces this topic. And I'll start again with the opening paragraph. Some slow week in summer, I should write a tirade against flip-flops. I unwisely remarked to my editor one disgusting August afternoon a few years back as we walked back from lunch behind a woman whose street-blackened soles could be glimpsed anew with each schlapping step. Now, during an early July lull between big summer movie releases, he's gone and called my bluff. And the truth is, I'm not really one for composing tirades. I'm a live and let live sort when it comes to personal grooming and style, and whatever qualities I'm remembered for at my funeral, I'm fairly certain neither hygiene nor chic will top the list, but the increasing prevalence of all-day urban flip-flop wear during the summer months is something we need to talk about as a culture. So Stevens does a couple of interesting things here. I think the level of detail is quite nice because it effectively foreshadows the argument she wants to make. Pay attention, for example, she hasn't necessarily here given us a clear, definitive indication of her thesis. But again, after reading the essay, if you return to this introduction, it is obvious that she's foreshadowing it. Notice, for example, the description of this anonymous woman and the way her feet look, according to Stevens, quote, whose street blackened soles. And so here, I think it's this sense that the discoloration of her soles perhaps speaks to the obvious lack of hygiene, according to Stevens, inherent to flip-flops, and even that sound that she tries to replicate with language like schlapping. I think all of this, again, does the work of foreshadowing her argument, which, again, we as readers only see or understand retroactively, which is to say, as we think back on what we've read, as perhaps even we return to the essay for maybe second readings or subsequent readings. But even the way she ends this introduction or the way she ends this opening paragraph, quote, but the increasing prevalence of all-day urban flip-flop wear during the summer months is something we need to talk about as a culture. I like how, and again, I think this is something you can utilize and something you can certainly deploy in your own essay. She wants to include all of us in this. You could almost read this as a kind of invitation. This is certainly an essay where Dana Stevens, as an individual writer, writes about something in culture or society that she sees that really frustrates her. But by making this gesture toward all of us collectively, she's really encouraging you to think that you have a place and that you have a part in this essay as well. And I suppose to some degree you do, or we all do, because we all interact to some degree in a social fashion. We are social animals, and there are certain spoken and unspoken rules that really dictate and determine how human beings socialize. But I think something else that's worth acknowledging here is this obvious, let us say, geographic distinction between Stevens as a New Yorker and those of us potentially reading this in a rural area of the American South. Because I think many of my students, and this is a moment or here, I just wanted to give everyone an indication of how students in the past have often read this essay. Many students have expressed some skepticism or even some incredulity towards Stevens and her argument. And we've spoken about why, and what we conclude or what we discover together as a class is, well, what it means to exist in the world in the American South and what it means to exist in the world in a heavily populated place like New York City. It's totally different, even if you just think about how transportation often works in this part of the country for a variety of different reasons. We drive cars as a way of getting where we need to go, but that is not necessarily true for larger, let us say, metropolitan areas like New York. Comparatively speaking, very few people have automobiles. People walk or use public forms of transportation. So I think not only population density, but also the way we travel and the way we interact with people might very well influence the way we read this argument. So I think that's an important thing to I think that's an important thing to understand and acknowledge, because if you were reading this and thinking, why would someone think what Dana Stevens does? It's probably because the way Stevens interacts with the world she occupies, is to some degree fundamentally different from the world you and I occupy. Again, if you are in the American South like I am. But a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about, and this question of what it means to exist in the world and exist in society is certainly important to the argument that Dana Stevens wants to make. Because if we're just getting to, let us say, her thesis statement or her big problem, the point she wants to make, the claim she wants to stake, I think it's best understood as this, quote, breaching of a social contract. And Stevens, she actually uses this language a couple of times or gestures towards this a couple of times in the essay. And here, by social contract, really Dana Stevens is gesturing towards a kind of philosophical tradition that tries to understand what responsibilities all of us as individuals have toward one another or towards society at large. And the notion of the social contract, and I believe she cites Rousseau, it's this agreement that all of us make, and you could argue to some degree we all sacrifice, and this will vary what I am about to say depending on the person, but we sacrifice a degree of our freedom for, let us say, a larger collective good. But it's more than just a larger collective good. I think for a notion like the social contract, the idea is if we all choose to accept certain rules that might, let us say, restrict our freedom, that on net makes or creates a fairer, safer, and more equitable society, which is not to say that any notions of a social contract in theory create an entirely or a fully safe society or an entirely and fully equitable society. But I think the idea is, in contrast to a notion like the state of nature, where perhaps all of us would just, marauder about without any thoughts or any consideration for those around us, accepting those sacrifices or accepting those at times limitations to our freedom, that makes, in theory, for a safer, more equitable society. Think about, for example, stoplights in society. Why do we have those, right? One could argue that those restrict an individual's ability to go where they want, when they want, at whatever speed they want, right? And sure, you could choose to break those laws. You could choose to not adhere to red lights when you see them or speed limits when you see them. But I think there are obvious consequences to that, or at times there are consequences to that, and one could argue that is the repercussions of breaching the social contract. But I think all of us understand the idea is, if we just didn't have stoplights or crosswalks or stop signs, any ways of perhaps managing, perhaps even policing automobiles, that would perhaps be a world that I'm not so certain I would want to live in. And perhaps all of you to some degree would agree, or perhaps you wouldn't. But all of this is to say, the social contract idea, or the notion that Stevens gestures toward, is this idea, again, that all of us might make individually certain sacrifices for a kind of greater good, or so that we are not just living in this rather chaotic state of nature. It's a way of trying to create a little more stability in society, where individuals both have the freedom to some degree to do what they want, while also acknowledging that they live in a world with other people, and because of that, they must make certain concessions. So, for Stevens, all of this is relevant regarding flip-flops, because for Dana Stevens, she argues that the flip-flop or flip-flops as footwear is a breach of that social contract. It is one of those moments, you might even imagine it's like someone driving recklessly on the road, not adhering to stop signs or crosswalks, red lights, or speed limit rules. They're just behaving as chaotically as possible. I think for Stevens, that is very much what the flip-flop as a shoe option represents. And listen, she makes other arguments against the flip-flop, but I think she really hangs her hat on this idea that it is a breach of social decorum, and because of that, it is a real problem. Look, for example, to the conclusion. Here, Stevens writes, quote, "My final line of argument against flip-flops is a more nebulous one, having to do with their laziness and lack of character as footwear. Because of the ease with which they're put on and removed, along perhaps with their generic ubiquity, flip-flops connote a sort of half-dressed slatternliness, a sense that the wearer has forgotten to do anything at all with his or her body from the ankles down. I was going to call them, quote, foot underwear, nomenclature that would be consistent with their older U.S. designation as thongs, a term still used in Australia, but that's not quite right. After all, it's not like you're going to put a pair of real shoes on top. More precisely, flip-flops are foot robes. And seeing hundreds of strangers walk by in dirty, sidewalk sweeping bathrobes, barely held on with loosely tied belts, the analogy holds up all the way through, is no one's idea of summer fun. Unless your daily commute is a stroll from your hammock across the white sands to the pina colada stand you manage in Waikiki, please consider leaving the foot robes at home. So there's a couple of things here. Again, I mentioned the social contract a moment ago. She's gesturing toward a sense of etiquette, which I think, again, etiquette is a key component to the social contract. Again, to this, at times, unspoken set of rules and regulations that all of us agree to uphold and adhere to live in a society. But again, I think the level of detail here is really quite interesting. I think Stevens, whether it's by using examples and analogies, I think she effectively shows you exactly what is problematic for her with flip-flops as a footwear option. Again, especially in a densely populated place like New York, and especially during the summer when it's hotter and stickier, and perhaps even it feels a bit grosser than it might in the winter, so on and so forth. But the other things that I really like about this essay are the different patterns of development she uses. There, you could imagine, for example, because one of the things that I always like to talk to my students about when thinking about actively combining these different patterns is, well, do you have a primary or an overarching pattern, and then perhaps all of these smaller subsequent patterns that help to develop your idea and develop your larger point? And I really think cause and effect is an important pattern for someone like Dana Stevens. Again, thinking about this breaching of the social contract and why it's a problem for us to do that, again, as she understands it, while wearing flip-flops. At this point, she's really identifying here is a potential problem, and here is, or a choice maybe to be more accurate, and here is the effect or the consequence of that choice. So I think this essay, even though, again, Stevens uses different patterns throughout, I think it's an excellent example of how to use cause and effect as a pattern. She uses, I think, compare and contrast at times. I think we saw that a bit in the conclusion. I also think she uses description, narration, which I've already discussed. And again, whether you agree with her conclusion or not, whether you agree with her argument or not, I would say to some degree that is not as relevant as what this essay can teach you. And I wanted to just quickly summarize what I think that is. What does this essay do that any or all of you should consider doing for your own work? Again, notice how Stevens, she writes about something, and I mentioned this earlier, it's not what Slate pays her to write about, but it's something she's interested and passionate about. So even if it's something that doesn't fall, broadly speaking, within her professional purview, she's not, again, a professional footwear journalist or writer, but it's something she's interested in. Let me try again. It's something she's excited about. It's a problem that really bothers her. And I think any of the essays that I ask you to write this semester, I think you should consider them as opportunities to explore topics and ideas that perhaps excite you and you are enthusiastic about, but also explore something that really bothers you, a problem that you think is worth exploring. But I would also say, notice how Stevens, she doesn't just gallivant off on these tirades. She finds a way to really ground her problem with flip-flops in what I would describe as reasoned and pragmatic arguments and points. Because I think at times, yes, all of us have things that bother us, but I think in particular, if it's something that bothers us, we are perhaps disinclined toward maybe at times doing the work of fully fleshing out an idea, fully thinking through our own perspective. So I think that's something important as well. Something else that I like about this essay is how, again, she takes something, and I've spoken about this multiple times throughout the semester, she takes something that in theory is not that important, but she finds a way to make it important and to make it relevant. Just because something seems like it's not important doesn't mean that it's not. You can find ways to make topics important, and I think this is a great example of how to do that, and I'll briefly talk about the Kirby tattoo essay as another example of how to do that. And I think finally, Dana Stevens, she takes this interesting philosophical concept, the social contract, right? And there's this whole rich body of writing and scholarship about it, and she finds a way to apply it in an applicable way to something that all of us to some degree understand, right? Which is flip-flops, footwear, etc. So that's what I think you could theoretically take or use conceptually of this essay and apply to your own writing. And so here at the end, I wanted to say something quickly about the Kirby essay that I asked you to read. It's about, for this week, of course, it's about tattoos and tattooing. And I think it's an interesting and fascinating essay. I don't necessarily know if I agree with Kirby's claims or conclusions as a person with tattoos, but what I do ultimately like about the essay, and it's similar to the Dana Stevens essay, this question of tattoos, what are their function, what are they for, what is their utility, it's something that Kirby explores, I would argue, in good faith. And that's part of what I like about it. And I think easily the most interesting part of the essay is when he takes to the streets, right? And just talks to people about tattoos and tattooing, their thoughts and feelings about it. And that's, I think, again, an excellent example of how to explore an idea in good faith and not just, let us say, rely on any preconceived notions or concepts you have. And what I also think is interesting about the Kirby essay, which is something I think all of us are so allergic to doing, he really changes his mind or shifts his perspective. So the way Kirby's thesis statement works, I think, is fascinating because I don't think this is something that we have detected or noticed in any of the essays. Anything that I've asked you to read this semester is how Kirby starts. And again, I think I said maybe something similar to this with the Orwell essays earlier in the semester, that if you stop reading any of Orwell's essays at a particular point, you might think he's making a different point from the one he's making, which means as a reader, you are incentivized, and perhaps even it's a requirement for you to read the whole thing and reckon with the whole thing. And I think Kirby's essay is quite similar because Kirby does shift his perspective. He shifts his opinion, and we as readers only know and understand that by reading the whole piece. And so in that way, you could imagine Kirby's essay is as much an argument, which it is, as an exploration of an idea. And again, I think you could use any of the essays that I ask you to write as opportunities to do that. You want to explore an idea. Perhaps you have a firm position on a topic, but you want to use your essay. You want to use the essay as a form to explore whether or not you're wrong, or perhaps even to challenge yourself, right? I want to see if placed under scrutiny, does my idea hold? Does my perspective hold? And I think it is a great critical thinking strategy for all of us to expose ourselves to that as often as we can, to place our ideas, our arguments, our perspectives under as much scrutiny as possible. And listen, that is not to say, and Kirby is quite clear about this, right? That is not to say that at the end, Kirby will now have, giant face tattoos or something. But I think the idea is Kirby now has a better understanding of the use and the utility of tattoos, and it's only by allowing this essay to challenge his preconceived notions that he was ever able to arrive at that conclusion. And that, I think, is interesting and has value, and I think is an excellent example, again, just to reiterate, of how you can use the essay as again, not just a space to support and develop an argument, but really to challenge yourself. And that I like. So, okay, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. This is Colin Cox for English 1010. Have a lovely day, and I will talk to you next week.